Hi, I'm Three Gnomes. I'm an indie game developer, and I'm so excited to do the first devlog for my newest indie game, Too Much Quests. Now, the first thing that you might notice is that it does blend 2D characters and 2D objects in the world with a 3D environment and a completely free camera for you to control. So what is Too Much Quests? It is a cozy RPG adventure game that's inspired by tabletop role-playing games that I like Dungeons & Dragons or the Call of Cthullu. The game puts you in the shoes of these four adorable but dangerous adventurers as they explore a multitude of shattered dimensions and deal with way too many quests. Along the way, you'll be battling a multitude of enemies from across these dimensions, you'll have to build up your abilities, and you'll even be able to create a nice little home for yourself as well. The core of this game is exploring, growing, helping those you meet, and creating a comfortable little home for yourself outside of these shattered dimensions you're exploring. In this first devlog, we're going to talk about the process of getting from the beginning to about this point, which is pretty close to where I am right now, what you're seeing on the screen. But I'm also going to talk about a lot of the big picture things like the concepting for it, how I came about designing the characters, and what I want from this game. If you're following my YouTube channel, thank you so much. If you're not, please consider liking and subscribing. That's going to be the best way to keep up with this game and the progress leading up to when I eventually release it. And if you're not familiar with me or my channel, well, let's just say this isn't my first rodeo. It's my second rodeo. I've made one other big indie game that I've released. Big as in I spent a lot of time on it, not big as in you might have heard of it. And this is going to be my second big project. So at this point, I'm a lot more comfortable. I'm not so much learning as much as I was in my first set of devlogs, but I am creating all of these new systems and figuring out new ways to do things, and anyone who knows any sort of coding or anything adjacent to coding knows that it is every day solving problems. That's the crux, that's the core of making games. Every day you're going into it and you're solving problems. It's a puzzle. And no matter how simple you think it might be, I promise you, you're going to run into problems and you're going to have to solve them. And to be honest, for me, that's part of the fun of being an indie game developer. But we're going to walk through all of those leading up to this point, and so much else. Anyways, I'm going to stop stalling. I just wanted you to see as much of the progress of where I'm at right now in my game development before I jump back to this point. And actually, to be fair, I've got to jump back a little farther. Oh, not that far. No, closer. There we go. So I've just finished Toby's Topsy Tale. It's done, it's finished. I'm finally able to move on and figure out what the next game I'm going to work on is. And as an indie game developer, this is one of the most exciting moments, trying to figure out what you're going to work on next. It was a big decision, and I really had two big concepts at this point. And to be upfront, I've gotten pretty decent at the coding side of things, but first and foremost, I'm an artist, and so I wanted to make something that would let me show off my skill set. And in my planning for my future game, there were two kind of paths I was looking towards. I had two concepts, and in my free time over the years, I'd been working on concept art for both of them. So the first concept I had was this 3D game where you'd be exploring as a little robot, and there were all these like religious allegories, and you'd be collecting specimens that are kind of similar to Pokemon. It was a whole thing. It involved an alien world. This is the art for it on the screen right now, but it just wasn't where my heart was at. I had this idea for you to be able to explore this world in 3D while you're playing as a 2D character. This way I could still work in a 3D space, but be able to use 2D characters and objects, which is very much where my skill set lies, making very creative 2D objects and characters. The big problem with that, and the reason I thought that it might not be achievable, is because I had a very specific goal in mind for how I wanted it to work. I didn't want it to be like Paper Mario, where a lot of the times the camera is fixed and you're just moving through the space as these 2D characters. I wanted it to be so you were a 2D character moving fluidly through 3D space. I needed it to look good, and if it didn't look good, I just wasn't going to do it. I was going to work on my other idea, and I gave it a try. So rather than starting a new project, I do this thing where when I'm testing something, I'll actually go into an older project, one that I'm no longer going to mess with, and just test the things in there. For example, I made this Feed Eggs 3D game a while back based on an I Think You Should Leave skit, and rather than just making a whole new file, I test things in that, and that's where I started with this. I designed this very simple little 2D prisoner character, loosely inspired by the prisoner in Elden Ring. I cut him up into pieces, and then I did my best to see if I could make him look in this space like I wanted. And after some trial and error, I got there. And that was exciting because then I knew I could really go crazy with this concept and do whatever I wanted, because it worked. And that's a big piece of advice I'll give everybody. If you have an idea, but you're not sure it'll work, you gotta do that beginning trial and error stage to see if what you're actually wanting to do is achievable. Doesn't have to be the final product. Clearly this doesn't look like what my game looks like later. But this is the concept of the minimum viable product, the MVP. If you want to make a game but you don't know if you can do it, you gotta hit that minimum viable product. You gotta see if it's achievable, if it works on its base level, and go from there. Anyways, minimum viable product done, let's talk game design. In my planning, I didn't want you to play as a single character for this RPG, I wanted you to play as an actual party, like as in a D&D party, with 4 distinct characters that you can switch between at any point. That way you're progressing all characters simultaneously, but you can lean more in one direction or another depending on how you stat your character as you level up. So let's look at those characters. First and foremost, we have Mogurt the Devourer. He's going to be our barbarian, our tough boy, who can take a lot of damage. Then we've got our cat, who's a quick hitter and is very stealthy. We've got our bird, who's going to be our bard. His name's Sumbad. And then we've got our wizard, our lizard wizard, Tiriana, who's also our healer. And that's the party. And as you can see, I did have to jump forward again to show you how this stuff is going to work in the future. So let's hop back to when this was just a conceptual phase. So to start with, I just had this art that I'd made of Mogurt the Devourer. It was just a drawing I made of him, and I had to take that and put it into a 3D space. So step 1 is taking that full image that I made and breaking it down so that it's in separate parts, specifically like a head, a body, arms, legs, any little pieces that need to move like his tongue or his belt buckle that's a skull, and turning each one of those into their own little piece. As you can see, I use Krita as my main art tool. That's where I went in and did all of this. You also have to add extra parts to kind of accommodate for the part that, you know, might show when you're moving the head or moving the arms. This will allow you to maneuver the character a little bit more when you start animating him without having to worry as much. But it is very complex, and it does revolve around a lot of conceptualizing how it's going to work when you get it in the engine. So it's a lot of pre-planning. Then you take those separate parts, and there's a bunch of different ways to do it. I started by going into Blender and putting them together there, which took a little bit of time to figure out how to do it right these first couple times. But once they were all together, I could take those, put them into Unity, and start figuring out how I'm gonna set up the materials so that they look as good as they did when I tested them previously. And with that, I had a Mogurt in the engine that I could animate to move and to do what I needed it to do. Before I animated him, I wanted to make sure that the camera thing that I had set up previously would work with this new character that I'd created. So I just set up a simple mechanic. It's simple code. It just makes the base layer that all of the other pieces are put on top of, it just makes them face the camera at all times. And I tested it out. And it was a little slow, kind of made it ominous as he turned to face you. But that was a pretty quick fix. Next, because I'd spent so long working on Toby's Topsy Tail in an older version of Blender, and without updating a lot of the things, I'd never used the input system for the controls, so I had to learn how to use that, and that was not too difficult, but it did take a little bit of time to learn. Personally, I'd recommend Jerry from Bliss Studio to learn this if you're going to try and learn it. He's a great teacher, and he makes great videos. Not sponsored, I just learned a lot from the guy, so figured I'd shout him out. Next up, I set up the character controller and cinema machines. You'd have a camera that you could control around the character, and you could move in relation to it. This character setup would work for pretty much all the characters. It just started with Mogurt. Technically, they're all going to control the same, or at least from the same character controller. They're just going to have different speeds and actions that'll only be available when you're playing as those characters. So essentially, I'm making the base, and I'm just going to slap them on like they're stickers later. So at this point, he can physically move, and you've got a camera that moves around him. However, there's no animation, and he also can't jump. So next step is animation. I wanted it to look like he was walking, and also have a separate idle animation for when he wasn't. Okay, and then ultimately, I felt like I loved how that worked. It was silly, it was goofy, it fit his character. Just a big chonky boy walking around. That was a lot of fun. And because I'd broken him down into all these separate parts, I had a lot of ability to move and maneuver him how I needed to make it fit the style that I was going for. And I was really glad that I made a lot of the extra parts movable, even though it was more work, such as the tongue or the skull belt buckle that he's got. Those little things just added so much extra flavor to his movement. So the next thing I wanted to work on was a little bit of a way to make it so that you felt like your character was actually moving where you were moving. Specifically, right now, if you move to the left, it looks like he's walking to the left. But if you move to the right, it doesn't look like he's moving to the right. He's not facing that way, right? So the simple solution that I kind of came up with is if you're moving to the left, then I'll have the code say that he'll have his scale set at, for example, 1. So that he's facing the direction that he's supposed to face. And then, when he moves the other way, his scale will be -1. So still the same dimensions, but just directly the opposite. And of course, only on that one axis that is going to affect which way he's facing. Otherwise, he'll flip upside down. And since it was going off of your controls, it honestly felt pretty smooth. After that, I needed to set up the animator float so that when he's not walking, when he's standing still, it'll go into the idle animation, and when he's walking, it'll switch back. And that goes off of his movement speed. After that, I needed to set up the ability to jump. And one of the problems that I faced more than anything else with this was with Toby, with my last character, I had essentially set him up completely custom. I didn't use the character controller that's provided by Unity. And so here I faced a bit of a learning curve where I had to figure out how that works and how to make him jump the way that I wanted him to jump. And that led to some pretty comical mistakes. But eventually I did get it figured out, and I felt like it was very smooth. It felt like he was heavy like he needed to be. I like it. And with this basic character controller set up now with movement and jump, I could finally start bringing in the other characters and just putting them on top of it and then animating them as I go. So I started with the cat, I cut him up into pieces just like I did the dog. Out of context, this is a horrible sentence and string of things I'm saying. But I took his parts, put them all together, back in Blender, which you see me do with the dog. After I figured all that out, got it situated the right way, exported it, popped it into Unity, put it all back together because a lot of it didn't seem to work the way that it was supposed to. And then I just slapped that whole piece on top of the character controller that I'd already made. And then he didn't have animation, but he could already move and operate pretty similar to how Mogert did because he was just slapped on top of the character controller. However, I didn't want him to feel exactly like Mogert. When you switch characters, there is going to be a difference in how they move. So I just made it where the cat moved a little bit faster and he could jump higher. And that was just a simple change to show that you're playing a different character. After that, I just had to set up his animations. I did a basic idle, walk, one for his jump, and then I slapped those on, and now he was pretty functional. Now that I had Mogert and the cat set up, I needed a way for the player to be able to switch between them at will, so I set that up. It was very rough, but it worked. So I haven't previously mentioned this, even though you might have seen it at the beginning, but all of the characters have a special ability that they're going to be able to do just when you're exploring the world. For the cat, he's going to have a very specific stealth ability where he essentially turns into a black blob on the ground, sort of like he's just turned into a little cat blob like they do when he's stealthing around. So first off is making the blob head. This actually is in 3D. I thought that would just make it look more inky and like it's on the ground in the way that I wanted. The eyes on it, he's got really reflective eyes, the cat does. So I made sure that those were shown on the stealth head that was created. So I set that up in Unity, and then when I started going, I put this little magical aura around him. I also originally had it where he could jump, but I ended up removing that so that when you're in a stealth mode, you're going to be slower, you're going to be limited. After that, I had it set up where now you could switch between the different characters, and I had to set it up where now you could switch into that ability to go into stealth mode. And that felt nice. Now you had a special ability that your cat could do. And it looked good, but beyond just being a stealth ability, it also physically changes your size, making you smaller, making you able to squeeze through different gaps. So I had to make it so that when you're in your stealth mode, your capsule collider actually shrinks down to match the new shape that you are, and then goes back when you switch back to your other forms. That way the stealth mode also operated as a way for you to squeeze through little gaps, which is very much something that a cat does. And now I needed to make it so that when you're moving in the stealth form, it actually looks like you're moving. I wanted it to be a very in and out, almost like it's breathing, like it's water moving, something like that. I wanted it to be a very fluid movement as he moved around. I also wanted there to be little black bits of almost like kitty litter or oil or soot coming off of him as he moved. So now the cat had his ability, it was a stealth. I wanted the dog to have his, and I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what that was. I'd already decided that he takes less damage when he's injured outside of combat, just because he's the barbarian, he's tough. But my girlfriend actually came up with an idea that I can't believe I didn't think of sooner, which is ground pound. He should have a ground pound ability. And I added that in, and especially with the particle effects that I put on it, I thought it just perfectly fit his character. He's a big heavy boy, breaks things when he stomps down on them. It felt great. The last thing I kind of did with these two before I moved on was make it so that when you switch between one and the other, they would have this little pop effect that would happen. Sort of a bit of a transition effect so that it looks like you're popping into each character as you transition. And then of course there's a particle effect that goes along with each character for that. And that's Mogert and the cat does have a name, he's just not going to tell anyone. But I don't want to move on to the bird yet, this video is getting kind of long, so if this is interesting to you, you want to see more of the process of me making this game, go ahead and like and subscribe so that you can see the next devlog when it comes out. We're going to be talking about making the bird. We're going to be talking about making the lizard. I've got a whole dialogue system I set up, spells, damage, shields, all kinds of stuff. And I haven't even started talking about the fact that this is kind of a meta thing where you're actually players playing characters in a game, but we'll get to all that later. Let me know in the comments which character is your favorite. Thank you for watching, and here's your side quest for the day. I want you to take the main character of the game you're working on, and if you haven't done this already, start thinking about how his silhouette is going to affect how well he's able to be recognized at a distance and in different contrasting environments.